Good morning, you're watching Daybreak. I'm your host, Katie Wilson, taking you through the day's top stories. Let's see what's making the headlines this morning. Middle East conflict escalates, raising fears of wider war and US ground involvement. EU leaders warn on Hormuz disruption as Middle East tensions rise and Ukraine divisions persist. Ukraine peace talks stall amid the Iran conflict, though new discussions could resume this weekend. For joining us this morning. Now, for today's top stories. A fast escalating conflict is raising new fears of a wider war in the Middle East. Iran is ramping up attacks. Israel says it has crippled Tehran's key military capabilities, and the US could be pulled deeper in, despite limited public support at home.
Iran stepped up attacks on Gulf energy facilities after Israel struck South Pars, its share of the world's largest gas field co-owned with Qatar. Because about 80% of Iran's electricity depends on natural gas, the strike threatens its power supply. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that after 20 days of operations, Iran no longer has the ability to enrich uranium or produce ballistic missiles, adding that Israel is continuing efforts to fully dismantle those capabilities.
We are acting now, not only to destroy the ballistic missiles and the remaining nuclear programs, very little remains, but also to destroy the industries that enable the production of these programs. And already now, after 20 days, I can tell you, Iran today has no ability to enrich uranium, and it has no ability to produce ballistic missiles. We are continuing to dismantle these capabilities. We will crush them completely, down to dust.
At the end of the press conference, Benjamin Netanyahu denied dragging the U.S. into the conflict, saying no one can dictate to Donald Trump. Trump said the U.S. needs more funding for the war, with the White House seeking $200 billion to replenish depleted supplies. The Pentagon estimates the conflict cost $11.3 billion in its first week, as it nears its fourth week.
$200 billion, I think that number could move, obviously. It takes money to kill bad guys. So we're going back to Congress and our folks there to ensure that we're properly funded for what's been done, for what we may have to do in the future. Ensure that our ammunition everything's refilled, and not just refilled, but above and beyond. I mean,
about 65% of Americans think Donald Trump will send troops into a large ground war in Iran, but only 7% support it, according to a Reuters/Ipsos poll released Thursday. The three-day poll showed Trump's approval rating at 40%, little changed from a previous survey after the February 28th attacks on Iran.
Well, with that in mind, let's take a look at what is making the front pages this morning, starting right here with A News in Baku. Middle East crisis disrupts travel flows, $56 billion loss and millions of trips at risk. So according to Oxford Economics, the ongoing conflict involving Iran is set to disrupt global travel on a massive scale. Gulf countries are expected to bear the brunt of this, given their reliance on tourism growth and their role as a major global transit hub. Now, this article says that Europe's tourism sector is particularly vulnerable to this, with countries such as France and the UK often relying on visitors from the Middle East, and they may well see a decline in that tourism. But as we see here, there is optimism at the same time, because shifting traveller sentiment is expected to drive a move towards destinations perceived as safer and closer to home. So southern European countries such as Spain, Portugal and Greece are expected to be the winners there. they could capture redirected demand as travellers seek alternative holiday options. Now, what about you? Have your plans been disrupted? Let us know on A News social media platforms. We'd love to hear from you. Now, to some other news, we turn to CNN and their analysis of President Trump and Prime Minister Takaichi's White House meeting. They say Trump and Takaichi are close, but Iran is putting that relationship to the test. So the two leaders were hoping to build on momentum from Trump's recent visit to Tokyo in this meeting, but of course, it's been overshadowed by that crisis in the Middle East, and it's also exposed Japan's energy dependence on the Middle East. Japan imports more than 90% of its crude oil from the Middle East, a reliance that deepened after it reduced imports of Russian energy following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, pressure is mounting from Washington as Trump is calling on US allies, including Japan, to send warships to help escort vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran is regularly attacking ships. And did you see the gaffe about Pearl Harbor? I suppose not a surprise from President Trump, a gaffe like that, but nevertheless, not what we expect from a president. Let us know your thoughts on that on our social media. But to a different kind of army now, the BTS army. BBC is reporting that up to 260,000 people are expected to turn up on Saturday at Gwanghwamun Square, where the K-pop stars will perform together for the first time since October 2022. There we go, 260,000 fans as the world's biggest band returns. It's set against the backdrop of a 14th century gateway to the Royal Palace. If you haven't been there, I really recommend it. The band's 1 hour set will include songs from their long-awaited new album, Arirang, and millions around the world can watch the show on Netflix if you can't make it to Seoul, as they've struck a live stream deal with BTS. Now, as I say, one of the world's biggest pop acts were at the peak of their fame when they had to enlist for mandatory military service back in 2022. And that was beginning with Jin, and Sugar, another member, was the last to complete the service in June last year, paving the way for a full group comeback. And their 82-day world tour across more than 30 cities across Asia, Europe and the US is set to begin now. I was living in Seoul back in 2023 during that hiatus, and let me tell you, BTS were everywhere. At home, I had a BTS reed diffusers. If you know there's 7 members in the band, you can even get days of the week socks with BTS members. They really are huge. I think this is a big moment for pop culture, so I'll certainly be watching it. But with that, that rounds up your press roundup for this morning. After the break, we'll be discussing the rest of the global news stories. Stay with us. Welcome back, you're watching Daybreak. Now, let's have a look at the global stories. President Trump has used a meeting with Japan's Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi to underline divisions among allies over the Iran conflict. Speaking at the White House, Trump singled out Tokyo for its support while taking aim at NATO partners in defending his administration's military strategy in the region.
US President Donald Trump hosted Japanese Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi at the White House on Thursday, with talks dominated by the escalating conflict with Iran, alliance dynamics and regional security. President Trump praised Tokyo's stance, singling out Japan as a key partner as tensions continue to disrupt global energy markets. He drew a sharp contrast with NATO allies, criticizing what he described as insufficient support, particularly in securing shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz.
We've had tremendous support and relationship with Japan on everything, and I believe that based on statements that were given to us yesterday, the day before yesterday, having to do with Japan, they are really stepping up to the plate. Yes, unlike NATO.
The US president defended the ongoing military campaign against Iran, claiming significant degradation of Tehran's capabilities and suggesting the operation is nearing completion. He also defended the decision to launch strikes without informing allies, arguing that secrecy was essential to the operation.
We've obliterated their navy. We've obliterated their just about everything there is to obliterate, including leadership. Their Navy's gone, their Air Force is gone, their anti-aircraft equipment is gone. We're flying wherever we want, Pete. We have nobody even shooting at us. When we go in, we went in very hard, and we didn't tell anybody about it because we wanted surprise. Who knows better about surprise than Japan? Okay? Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? Okay? Right? You know, he's asking me, no, you believe in surprise, I think much more so than us. Well, I'll be going.
The meeting also touched on regional geopolitics, with Trump raising Japan's relationship with China. Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi emphasized a measured approach, reaffirming Tokyo's commitment to dialogue.
Japan has been consistently open to dialogue with China, and also, second, we have been addressing our relations with China in a calm manner. And also, speaking of the US-China relationship, my sincere hope is that the relationship will be something conducive for our regional security and also ensuring the global supply chain in the world.
The meeting comes as oil prices surge and tensions in the Strait of Hormuz intensify, with Washington continuing to press allies for greater involvement while insisting it can act alone if necessary.
It's not easy.
And to unpack what all of this means, we are joined by Shijiro Takeshita, Professor at University of Shizuoka. Always good to have you with us, Professor. Now, what were your main takeaways from this meeting?
Well, it was a lot more delicate than I thought, partly because of the fact that, many expected Mr. Trump to basically force, Takaichi-san to bring in, our self-defense force. As he had been doing to NATO nations. He didn't do that. I think he was well briefed that it would have been very, very difficult for both parties if they started negotiation that way.
And we're hearing about Tokyo's energy dependence on the Middle East. How concerned is Japan about that?
Extremely. In fact, we're probably the one that should be concerned the most, considering that our dependency on oil is 99%, and 90% of that, as you reported, comes from the Strait, and also the fact that we can't really reduce the dependency to oil. After the Great Earthquake, our dependency to nuclear has dropped from 30% to 0. Now we're trying to creep it back to 20% by 2040, but it's not going to happen overnight. And many people say, well, why don't you use alternative energy like, wind or, solar? The fact is, if you look at the composition of Japanese industry, we excel in areas like precision machinery, semiconductors, what have you. These things that need stable source of energy that can't be provided by alternative energy. So basically, we're in a cul-de-sac kind of situation where we have to continuously rely on oil. And over 90% of that comes from the Strait, as you reported, which is a very grave danger for our economy as a whole.
It's really interesting how you mentioned that remapping of the Japanese economy since Fukushima. And pressure also appears to be mounting from Washington to send warships to help escort vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. How is Tokyo reacting to that? What's their view?
Again, the fact that Mr. Trump didn't really specify on that and didn't push on that was very positive, because I think both parties realize that the main aim here is to reaffirm the mutual enemy, should I say, or I should say mutual target of the people that they have to be worried about, which is, in my opinion, China this time around. And obviously, from that point of view, I don't think Trump wanted to put Takaichi in a very, very difficult spot, because under this current circumstance, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, under a pacifist constitution, to bring in our forces, to the Strait. Now, we've had cases where we basically use minesweeping, back during the Gulf War, and also, I think, in 2020 as well. But, that was after the incident has simmered down, to basically sweep the mines. So the situation here is quite different.
And as you mentioned, that support, Trump backed Takaichi in the recent elections. Do you think she's achieved the stability she's wanted despite this outbreak of war in the Middle East?
Absolutely. I think she did a great job. And possibly, I think the delegates did a good job as well to, again, pre-inform Mr. Trump about, what would be very awkward and difficult, if he pushes too much about, bringing in our, I said, self-defense force into the strait. So that was a main focal and most worrying point, but that at least have been subsided. So from that point of view, I think it's quite clear it's a win-win situation both for Takaichi-san and also for Mr. Trump, where he has a very good and strong support from one of the allies.
And finally, you mentioned awkward moments. We have to talk about that Pearl Harbor gaffe. What was the reaction to that in Japan?
Well, all I can say is that's very Mr. Trump. And, hey, I have to be very, very polite and politically correct on your program. So let's end it at that. That's very Mr. Trump.
Very diplomatic answer there. Thank you very much, as always, for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Now, the US is ramping up its military presence in the Middle East, deploying more Marines as the conflict with Iran escalates. Let's go live to Washington and our correspondent, Ubi Shabanda.
Thousands of more Marines and sailors are being deployed to the Middle East as reinforcements for the ongoing war against Iran. Officials in Washington say that the Boxer Amphibious Ready Group and the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit are expected to sail to the Middle East as part of a surge of naval power in the region. On Thursday, President Trump told reporters that he currently has no plans to order the deployment of ground troops on Iranian territory, though he did say that he has not necessarily ruled out the option. The fighting has been steadily escalating since the United States and Israel first struck Iran 3 weeks ago as part of Operation Epic Fury to neutralize Iran's missile production and nuclear weapons program. U.S. military planners are deliberating whether American boots on the ground will be required as part of a takeover of the strategic Kharg Island in the Arabian Gulf. Iran exports most of its oil onto tankers that dock on that island. Last week, the Pentagon ordered over 2,000 Marines from the Expeditionary Unit to deploy to the Middle East. This unit is specialized in amphibious assaults that are supported by sea and air power, which indicates, along with the other reinforcements, that the White House could give the order for all these units to enter Iranian territory if required. And 7 U.S. allies announced in a joint statement on Thursday that they are supporting what could be a coalition to reopen the Strait of Hormuz for commercial ships and oil tankers. However, the statement did not include any firm commitment to send naval warships or any other resources that would be required for such a vast undertaking. Ube Shabander, A News, Washington.
A sharp escalation in fighting between Israel and Hezbollah has left civilians dead and intensified violence across the region, with missile strikes, air raids and ground clashes reported in and around Jerusalem.
4 Palestinian women died as a result of Iranian missile strike in West Bank. Also, a cluster bomb killed foreign worker here in Israel after sirens were activated 6 times overnight. Hezbollah launched a barrage of dozens of rockets at northern Israel, but also towards Gaza border. Israel stepped up airstrikes on Beirut, killing at least 10 people and destroying a 10-story building near the city center in the 3rd week of its war with Iran-backed Hezbollah. In a further escalation, Israeli warplanes begin striking bridges over the Litani River that link southern Lebanon to the rest of the country, destroying at least 2 of them, regarding Lebanese state media. The Israeli military wants to prevent Hezbollah transferring fighters and weapons and reiterated a warning for residents to leave the south. Hezbollah strikes 6 Israeli tanks, inflicts heavy casualties on invading troops in South Lebanon. Residents were urged to move north immediately to avoid being carried in active combat zones.
To some other news now, and European Union leaders gathered in Brussels on Thursday for a meeting focused on the conflict in the Middle East, as well as securing a €90 billion loan to Ukraine to support its war with Russia. Here's Anita Sharma with more details.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, with leaders at the EU summit in Brussels facing mounting pressure on multiple fronts as divisions over Ukraine funding deepen and the Middle East crisis drives a new energy shock. EU leaders agreed that the Strait of Hormuz must be reopened amid global shipping disruptions that are pushing oil and gas prices sharply higher. However, they did not commit to any military role, resisting pressure from Washington to help secure the route. French President Emmanuel Macron said all minds must calm down regarding the Middle East conflict and that the fighting should stop at least for a few days to give negotiations a chance. As for Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, well, she reportedly warned that Iran's attacks on Qatar's gas fields were serious for gas-dependent Italy, prompting her to once again call for reforms to the EU's carbon pricing mechanism. On Ukraine, the summit adopted conclusions without Hungary and Slovakia. Prime Minister Viktor Orban continued to block the €90 billion loan, saying he would support Ukraine only when Hungary gets oil back through Druzhba. European Council President Antonio Costa, according to EU officials, said that kind of behavior was not acceptable. And Dutch Prime Minister Rob Jetten agreed, saying more support for Ukraine must be delivered as quickly as possible. Meantime, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz reportedly complained to EU leaders that discussions about the Iran conflict deflected time and attention away from the summit's original plan to address ways to boost European competitiveness. During his closed-door speech, the German conservative apparently pushed to introduce a reference to an ambitious AI omnibus by July, a package to streamline EU legislation. Well, with the EU summit heading into dinner last night, one diplomat said it was unclear how the talks on the long-term budget and defense would work and that, quote, it's a mess. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
The Kremlin says talks between Washington, Moscow and Kyiv to end the war in Ukraine are on a situational pause after the Iran conflict began, though Ukraine's president expects new discussions this weekend. The Kremlin says talks between Washington, Moscow and Kyiv to end the war
We need
to the UK now, where a health official said on Thursday that it was too soon to declare a meningitis outbreak in southeast England contained, as authorities reported 7 new cases of the disease, which has killed 2 people so far. Zainab Farizada reports.
A meningitis outbreak in Kent is worsening, with 27 cases now confirmed. According to the UK Health Security Agency, this follows a second university in Kent confirming a case among students. A 21-year-old student at the University of Kent and a teenage pupil at a school in the town of Feversham have died in the current outbreak, as the disease continues to affect students and young people across the region. Most cases have been linked to the Club Chemistry nightclub in Canterbury between 5 and 7 March, Health Secretary Wes Streeting said. In response, vaccination eligibility has now been expanded. All students at affected schools and universities, along with those previously offered antibiotics, can now receive the MenB jab. More than 900 University of Kent students have already been vaccinated since yesterday, forming long queues at the university's sports centre. Health Secretary Wes Streeting, who has described the spread as unprecedented, said the government is expanding its vaccination program to more students while considering whether to broaden the general vaccination campaign. He also said the number of suspected cases is expected to rise in the coming days due to the disease's 7 to 10 day incubation period. Britain's largest pharmacy chain said it is experiencing unprecedented demand for the meningitis B vaccine, resulting in limited supplies across the country. Wes Streeting added that 20,000 additional vaccine doses will be released to the private market to ease shortages as demand surges. In a typical year, Britain sees about 350 cases, roughly one per day, according to government estimates. The European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control says the risk of invasive disease to the general population in Europe remains very low. Zeynep Farizadeh, News, Manchester, United Kingdom.
The European Union and Iceland have signed a new security and defence partnership, aiming to strengthen cooperation on issues from maritime security to cyber resilience. Iceland's foreign minister says the country could join the EU as early as 2028, with a referendum planned on restarting membership talks.
The European Union and Iceland formalized a new phase in their relationship on Wednesday, signing a security and defense partnership that officials say will deepen strategic cooperation across a range of sectors, from maritime security to the protection of critical infrastructure.
Today's decision is driven by the simple but powerful reality our security is shared, and also our challenges are shared. From Russian threats to the seabed infrastructure, to China's growing interest in the Arctic, addressing these together gives us great leverage. And this new partnership will deepen our cooperation in areas that matter to our citizens, that matter to the safety of our citizens, from maritime security and protection of critical infrastructure to strengthening resilience against cyber threats.
During the visit to Brussels, Iceland's foreign minister told that her country could join the European Union as early as 2028, adding that she expects fisheries and agriculture to be the toughest points of negotiation with the bloc. The Icelandic government has proposed holding a referendum on August 29th on resuming EU membership negotiations, a process Reykjavik abandoned in 2013.
Saying a yes, it opens doors, it opens possibilities, instead of saying no, from my point of view, you are closing doors, and there is not so much security you can offer by saying no. But in the end, as I said, it's up to the Icelandic people to decide, and I hope they will say yes.
The reason why Iceland stopped the process in 2013 was widespread public opposition, disputes over fishing rights, a swift economic recovery without the euro, and the Eurozone crisis, which made the EU less attractive. The Nordic country is a founding member of NATO and is already part of the European single market and the Schengen open border travel zone.
Over to a quick break now. When I return, we'll take a look at the regional headlines, where an analyst will be joining me to dig further into some of the key stories. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me this morning. Now, Turkey has urged Iran not to widen the conflict in the Middle East, warning against attacks on regional countries. Speaking in Doha, Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said Israel was the main driver of the war, but stressed Tehran carries a historic responsibility to avoid further escalation. Meanwhile, Qatar has rejected Iran's claim that its latest strikes targeted US-linked sites. The country's Prime Minister said the attack hit a Qatari gas facility, calling it clear evidence the strike was not limited to foreign interests.
While speaking with Iran, we are trying to ensure that the war does not spread. Iran itself is being attacked, but there is nothing that can justify it attacking countries in the region. This further deepens divisions, spreads the war, and intensifies the crisis. We continuously offer Iran our most sincere and friendly advice as a responsible state. The only agenda item was how to stop Iran's attacks against the region, and countries in the region that are directly and heavily exposed to these attacks held a meeting to seek advice from brotherly countries like us about the measures to be taken.
There are, unfortunately, continuous Iranian claims that the attacks are attacks on US assets or on US bases in Qatar and the region. We reject this claim, which cannot be accepted under any circumstance. The biggest proof of this is that the attack which happened yesterday was an attack on a Qatari natural gas facility, which is a source of income for the Qatari people, but not just for the Qatari people. What they did yesterday also impacted the millions of people who Qatar is helping. We reserve our full right to respond to this attack through all available legal means, and for these attacks there will be a cost according to international law.
Well, let's bring in Chingiz Mamadov, research alumni at NED and the Woodrow Wilson Centre, to unpack the growing regional tensions. Thank you for joining us. Now, we just heard from Hakan Fidan there. How serious is the risk of this conflict spreading further into the region?
Katie, first of all, good morning, and let me use this opportunity and congratulate our viewers with both Ramadan and Nowruz Bayram, very important holidays for Azerbaijan. Regarding the risk, any war which happens nearby your borders has a risk, no doubt about that. So let's evaluate what we have seen recently: drone attacks on Nakhchivan, on the airport, and the school. Did it happen, let's say, under the will of the central Iran government? Difficult to say, because President denied, and there were rumors that, it was not Iran responsible for that, but it happened. So, which means that there are forces within Iran which, for different reasons, could be interested in spreading this conflict outside of Iran, and not only on the Middle East, but also to the South Caucasus. So it may happen if, let's say, regime in Iran weakens. In this case, when there is no centralized government, then, separate military commanders may use this opportunity to fulfill some of their own, dark dreams. Uncontrolled event. Another risk posed for Azerbaijan is if, for example, ground operation starts in Iran, and main force for ground operation right now is considered by the United States and by Israel as a Kurdish separatists. And there are already news, unconfirmed, but nowadays many things are unconfirmed, but then these news are confirmed, that some Kurdish separatists or terrorists are already within Iran, that they came from Iraqi Kurdistan, and they are already within Iran. And as we witnessed during December-January demonstrations, there were Kurdish separatists, armed separatists, which acted within Iran. So we can assume that there are already forces within Iran, Kurdish separatists, which may use arms to kind of conduct ground operation. But in the north-western part of Iran, there are regions where kind of Azerbaijanis and Kurds live together within each other. So it poses some danger for Azerbaijanis, South Azerbaijanis within Iran. And unlike of Kurdish separatists, Azerbaijanis are not armed. Azerbaijanis are present in power structures within Iran, in military, in theocratic regime, in administration, but citizens are not armed. So which means that if central government, is weakened and lost control over the country, in this case, Kurdish separatists, armed Kurdish separatists, they have advantage. And it may create risks for southern Azerbaijanis. So I consider right now this as the main risk for Azerbaijan, because both Azerbaijan and actually Turkey also will have to somehow, intervene into this process.
And what about that process then? So you mentioned that sort of power vacuum that we're seeing in Iran. How does Turkey deal with that diplomatically? How does Hakan Fidan position himself?
Turkey is a very important player, and we observed that Turkey became even more important player during the last decades during Erdogan's presidency. We saw it in events in Syria. We saw in events when there was a crisis in 2017 in Qatar, around Qatar. Turkey played a key role in that. We saw Turkey played an important role during our 44 days war. How they played? They simply, prevented others to intervene into the conflict, allowed Azerbaijan to deal with Armenia, one-to-one. That's why Turkey has their own interests in what happens in Iran. Turkey tried to kind of prevent this war. They did the best. They offered, the territory for negotiations. were very active in that process, but war started. And Turkey was not responsible for this war, but nowadays war is happening. So Turkey tries to convince Iranian government that not to spread this conflict to wider geographic regions. But if central government in Iran collapses, in this case the process becomes uncontrollable or difficult to control. That's why I think if Turkey feels that there is a need for intervention, I think Turkey will intervene.
And you mentioned earlier those drones in Nakhchivan airport. There's also been ballistic missiles in Turkish airspace. Do you think Iran is intending on widening this conflict, or do you think Iran is simply acting defensively?
I think this is a good question, Katie, but I think within Iran there are now several competing forces which see the development trajectories differently. They consider different scenarios. For example, we saw it in the statements by XIR leaders, IRGC leaders, and President Pezeshkian. And we saw that there are different attitudes by the United States and by Israel to, for example, figures like Rouhani, like Pezeshkian. Zafar is, almost disappeared, but they may appear again. I think many things will depend how strong Iran is, how strong Iran could be in resisting these pressures from the United States and Israel. It depends whether Iran has military resources to continue this resistance. If they do have, this is one scenario. In this case, I think leaders of IRGC, radicals, clerical radicals, will have more say in future negotiations, discussions. But if, for example, administrative structure of Iran is kind of destroyed, if there are also some internal forces which will, maybe there will be again some resistance, maybe some demonstrations, we may have different scenario. Main problem, Katie, actually I'm observing events in languages that I know, in Azerbaijani, Russian, Turkish, English. I actually envy analytics which say very confidently this will happen or that will happen. I think we have insufficient information. We don't know what are Iran's reserves. We don't know what is the help provided to Iran by outside forces, at least by Russian Federation and People's Republic of China. So we don't know yet. That's why difficult to predict. And war in general is event difficult to predict. So many variables. You cannot control all of them. That's why I would say that we should be cautious, and Azerbaijan demonstrates, in my personal opinion, this right position. Azerbaijan stays away of that conflict, provides some humanitarian aid to Iran, some humanitarian aid, and demonstrates that it's not party to the conflict. And I think this is the right position.
And let's talk more about Azerbaijan's position, because it is quite unique in that it's one of very few Muslim majority conflicts that has a relationship with Israel. Very recently we've seen that relationship with Trump develop. So, and even geographically, Azerbaijan is in a position in close proximity to this. So another question that's difficult to predict, but how do you think Azerbaijan's alliances may be reshaped by this conflict?
Of course, this war will impact the global event, and we should consider this war not only purely in terms of US-Israel against Iran, but rather in global context, rivalry between the United States and People's Republic of China for global dominance. And it will be the first time during last at least 500 years that Western dominance is under threat. It happened in some ways that, during last 500 years, one Western country replaced the other as global dominant power. It started somewhere from, Italy, Venetian Republic, then, Spain, then the Netherlands, then France, United Kingdom, and finally, United States. United States is the last Western power which has potential for global dominance. And if global dominance of the United States is broken, it will mean that 500 years of Western dominance are over. That's why United States is so agitated. They don't want to lose this dominance. That's why this war is not only with Iran. This war is, also, this is proxy war for the People's Republic of China, because they use Iran to weaken the United States. And United States, yesterday, President Trump asked for $200 billion from the Congress. According to different data, United States spends each day around $3 billion each day, which means that, United States spends money while China gains money from different, by investments, by producing and supplying the world with different goods. And according to different calculations, within 15 to 20 years, China will reach the military level of the United States. Right now, they reached already economic level of the US. In 15, 20 years, they will reach military parity with the United States.
And just to chime in, another massive economic element of this is energy. How do you think that's going to play a role in this wider conflict, and particularly in this region?
This is exactly the aim of the United States, because China receives a significant share of its energy from the Gulf countries. Not only from Iran, but from other Gulf countries as well. I think one of the aims of the United States is to control this flow of energy from Gulf states, including from Iran. I think that's one of the reasons why, for example, United States tries not to destroy oil infrastructure, oil industry of Iran. They would rather prefer to control it, not to destroy it. And I think China understands that, and that's why China, I think, provides some help, not only intelligence, but maybe also some technological help, for example, chips for Iran. It may happen. I don't know, and nobody knows, because this is very, very confidential information. I think nobody will be able to reveal that. But if there is interest, let's call classics, recall classics. If there is an interest, why China wouldn't do that?
Well, there you go. It's certainly many unknowns here, but I'm sure this isn't the last we're going to be discussing it. Don't go anywhere. We're going to get the rest of the regional headlines, but thank you so much for joining us and providing your analysis.
Thanks for inviting me, Kate.
Thank you very much. Now, a delegation from the Chinese military is set to hold talks with the European Union and NATO next week. The meeting in Brussels is expected to focus on the growing conflict in the Middle East. A-News' correspondent in Beijing has more.
China's military is set to hold rare talks with the European Union and NATO in Brussels next week as the ongoing Iran war continues to shift the global security landscape. Officials from the People's Liberation Army are expected to sit down with European and NATO counterparts to discuss issues like crisis management, military transparency, and strategic stability. Topics that have taken on new urgency as conflicts intensify across multiple regions. The push for dialogue comes at a time when the Iran war is creating ripple effects far beyond the Middle East, disrupting energy flows and raising fears of a wider confrontation. European governments are trying to balance calls for diplomacy with pressure to respond more firmly, exposing divisions within the West and uncertainty over how the conflict might evolve. For China, the talks show a careful balancing act. Beijing has been calling for restraint and political solutions while also protecting its economic and strategic interest. The upcoming meeting suggests that despite underlying tensions, there is growing recognition on all sides that maintaining communication is essential as the global security situation becomes more volatile. Manri Mufti, A-News, Beijing.
There's cautious optimism this Eid as Afghanistan and Pakistan announce a temporary halt in military operations after weeks of rising tensions. The pause was brokered with support from regional partners. A-News' correspondent Tamim Bahis reports from Kabul.
As Afghans celebrate Eid, there's at least some relief here in Kabul as a pause in the conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan offers a brief respite during the festive period. Both countries have agreed to briefly suspend military operations, marking a significant development after a month of escalating tensions. Afghanistan's government spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid confirmed that Afghan security forces will halt their defensive operations during Eid, also acknowledging mediation efforts by Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey. Mujahid emphasized that while the pause reflects goodwill, Afghanistan remains committed to defending its sovereignty and will respond decisively to any threats. On the other side, Pakistan's Information Minister Ataullah Tahir announced a similar move, suspending military operations until March 24. However, Pakistan has made it clear that any cross-border or terrorist activity will trigger an immediate and intensified military response. The temporary ceasefire offers a brief respite for civilians on both sides, though deep mistrust remains. Islamabad continues to accuse Kabul of harboring militants, claim Afghanistan strongly denies. For now, the focus shifts to Eid celebration, with hopes that this short pause could open the door for long-term de-escalation. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, A News.
And finally this morning, artificial intelligence agencies are gaining popularity in China, offering to complete more complex tasks like ordering coffee or creating presentations. But this comes amid growing security concerns over data privacy.
China is seeing rising interest in artificial intelligence agents, which users say are capable of completing more complex tasks than AI chatbots. The growing popularity comes alongside an increasing number of AI agents built on the OpenClaw platform. The platform allows agents to perform complex tasks with minimal human input, such as editing videos, creating presentations or ordering coffee, while operating seamlessly across desktop software, cloud services, mobile tools and smart home devices.
So the chatbot that most of the people are using at this stage is very passive, but agents that we are seeing emerging from the OpenClaw movements are a lot more autonomous, which means they can mimic human action and be able to execute tasks autonomously. So this is directly coinciding with what the Chinese government wants when it comes to the AI Plus initiative, where they want to see a lot more AI being deployed across multiple verticals.
However, the push for more autonomous AI agents has also raised security concerns over access controls and the handling of sensitive data. Some say security capabilities need to be strengthened as individuals and companies pursue efficiency and convenience by entrusting their data to such AI agents.
The main point I wanted to share with everyone today is this. With OpenClaw, the greater its capabilities, the greater the risks. In the process of pursuing efficiency and convenience, security needs to be addressed up front. Security and efficiency need to be considered together. Only in this way, by doing a good job of security governance and control, can OpenClaw become more manageable and be deployed and implemented on a large scale.
For now, OpenClaw's rise in China appears to be driven by a mix of public curiosity, commercial interest and official support, with its next phase likely to depend on whether security protections can keep pace.
Well, that's it for Daybreak this morning. We'll be back on Monday, but have a wonderful weekend. And for those of you celebrating, wish you a happy Ramadan and a wonderful Nowruz. Thank you for watching.